Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. So glad you're joining us today. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jeffery Koperski. He's a philosopher and he does a lot of work in the laws of nature and the question of how does God interact in the world. So Dr. Koperski, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm good, Zach. Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We're going to be talking about just how does God interact in the world and looking at different views, such as like the interventionist view or like quantum indeterminacy, just all kinds of interesting things here. So to start off, could you talk a little bit about like who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a philosopher of science. I've been teaching here at Saginaw Valley State University in Michigan for about 25 years. I got my PhD from Ohio State University, and most of my early work was on something called chaos theory, which most of you have probably not heard of. It was a really hot topic, though, back in the day. Before that, I got a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, not philosophy. In fact, I took exactly one course in philosophy as an undergraduate. I did not like it, but eventually I read a book by the Christian philosopher, J.P. Moreland, and his first book was called Scaling the Secular City. After having read that, then I kind of gave it another chance. And so I came back to philosophy in graduate school, and I've been here ever since. So these days, almost all of my work is somewhere in the intersection of science, philosophy, and religion. And so I'm not an apologist, but people who do apologetics often find at least some of what I do useful.
Yeah, it's super interesting to think about these things. I do have to ask you, really hard question here. Are you an Ohio State football fan at all? Because you did your PhD.
As a matter of fact, yes, I am. So, I grew up in Ohio, and then I ended up going to Ohio State. One of my sons is in graduate school at Ohio State. So, yes, we are in fact Buckeye fans. I don't know if that disappoints you and members of your audience, but yes, I am.
We might have to just end the recording now because I'm from State College. So I'm a Penn State fan my whole life.
I
just grew up in that town. So
well, I live in Michigan,
ruin our season.
so it's not. I'm not popular on that front here either. But that's okay. We can all get along.
Well, God bless you, and I pray for your safety as you continue.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk about like what got you interested in the question of how does God interact in the world? So you talk a little bit about your interest there.
Sure. So years ago, I was in a 2-week seminar with a gentleman named John Polkinghorne. And Polkinghorne was this very well-known particle physicist back in the 60s. And he eventually left physics. He became an Anglican priest and a theologian. So he kind of had a foot in both worlds. And so during that time, we read a lot of things that John had written. We read stuff by other people, and a lot of people in this field, a lot of people writing in this area of divine action, how God actually does things in the world. At the time, they thought that this thing that I mentioned before, chaos theory and quantum mechanics, they thought maybe those could be the keys to understanding divine action, how God works. But even back then, and can continue to today, I'm kind of skeptical about those approaches. And part of it was I noticed early on that the people who were doing the writing, all the people we were reading in that seminar, they either had a background in theology, they were theologians, or physics. So you sometimes had physicists that would weigh in on the question. But the questions they were asking were actually matters of philosophy. They weren't matters of theology proper. They weren't matters of science proper. They're really philosophy of science and philosophy of religion. And from a philosopher's point of view, at least, their answers were often a little naive. They were missing some important distinctions and moves that you needed to make. The second thing, and this is what bothered me more, was that if they were right, when you saw their models for exactly how God interacts with the world, if they were right, then really God wouldn't be able to do all that much. There just really wasn't much room in nature for God to do anything. Well, that bothered me a lot because I have a fairly robust view about things like answered prayer and the like. And so I think there is something important at stake when it comes to this question of divine action. If we get the answer wrong, it's going to have a direct bearing on our theology, especially about things like answered prayer. So that's really what drew me into it originally.
That's super interesting. So could you go over like some of the different ideas about how does God interact in the world and like how different philosophers and scientists and such might answer the question?
Sure. So there's a whole spectrum of views here. So let me give you the kind of the two extremes. Let me give you the boundaries and then kind of fill in the middle a little bit. So on one extreme, historically at least, are what we would call deists, with a D. And so the deists thought that God created the universe, but then that's about it. So they think that God doesn't interact with humanity at all, which for a deist, then that means like all the major religions, they're all false. God's basically just a creator, and that's it. So that's one extreme. You don't find that many deists out there today. Some, but not many. At the other end, at the other extreme, there are people who think that God is just continually stepping in and breaking the laws of nature just all the time, literally just, second by second. I've met people that think that God is intervening on their behalf, again, literally all day long, sometimes in obvious ways and other times not. So in between them, you've got kind of, again, variations. So there are some people that think that God doesn't need to intervene in nature because he's kind of providentially worked everything out in advance. So, God foresaw everything that would happen. And so he just kind of, built his responses into creation itself. So on that sort of view, God already decided at creation how he would answer your prayers and how he would respond. And that's just like built into creation itself. So on that sort of view, God doesn't actually respond to your prayers in real time. He doesn't intervene when answering those prayers. Things just unfold according to his will as time goes on. So again, there's no real intervention there. Another option, again, somewhere in the middle here, somewhere between the extremes, is that God does directly influence the world, but he does so in particular ways. So there are a lot of folks out there, a lot of theologians, that would say God can do whatever God does whatever he wants, but he doesn't violate the laws of nature. That's kind of a constraint. And people who hold this view would say the reason for this is God ordained the laws of nature, and so having done so, he wouldn't come back later and break his own laws. So again, that's another view. There are more reasons for why they think that. And then finally, there are those who would say there really aren't any limits. God doesn't worry about breaking the laws of nature. He can do that if he wants, and if he needs to. And so again, there's this deism on one hand, kind of extreme interaction and breaking the laws of nature on the other, and then all sorts of things in between.
It's really interesting. So one of the views is the interventionist view with regards to how God interacts with the world. So could you talk a little bit about like what that is and kind of your thoughts on like if it's a plausible idea or not?
Sure. So interventionists believe that when God acts, God does violate the laws of nature, and the interventionists, they're okay with that. And I think this is probably what most conservative Christians believe. So they look at the Bible and they see things like, the parting of the Red Sea or Jesus turning water into wine. And they would say, well, of course God is breaking the laws of nature. I mean, that's what's going on. So I kind of think of intervention as the default view for most Christians. But again, a lot of theologians don't like it. Some think, again, that God just wouldn't violate his own laws. Some think that divine intervention conflicts with science. I think they're wrong about that. I think when people say that divine action and miracles conflicts with science, they're taking a naturalistic approach to science. So naturalism on this view just says that nature is all there is. There's no God, there's no angels, there's no souls. And so, yeah, if you kind of take naturalism and put that into the very definition of science, then divine intervention conflicts with science because on a naturalistic view that there's no God. But again, I think naturalism isn't about science. It's a alternative philosophical view that's contrary to theism. So what I'm trying to say is there's no conflict between science and God, including divine intervention. There's a conflict between theism and naturalism, right? Because we think that God exists, and the naturalist says not.
So when we look at like these different views with regards to like how God interacts in the world and such, what do you see as like the most plausible? Like if you were going to say this is where I lean towards, or this is where I'd accept, where do you kind of go with this question, Dr. Koperski?
Well, like I said, I think the interventionist view is the default view. But when I look at the arguments from non-interventionists, the ones, especially the ones, and this is I think maybe most writers out there today, most theologians writing, they do have a problem with God breaking his own laws. They think that God just wouldn't do that, that, laws of nature come from the divine will. God ordained the laws of nature. And so given those are the rules that God himself set up, and he could have set up whatever rules he wants, God's going to work within those rules. And so for those folks, I have tried to come up with a model of divine action that kind of fits within that those constraints. So I do have a way that I've tried to explore in the book where God can actually do a lot. So I think there's a lot of freedom for God to act, even though God doesn't violate the laws of nature. So technically, yeah, I'm one of those non-interventionists. I think when God acts, at least most of the time, he doesn't violate his own laws. Now, if it turns out my model on that, if my book's been out for a little over a year, and as scholars interact with that and criticize it, if it turns out that my suggestion just doesn't work, if it turns out there are flaws, my drop back position is interventionism. So I don't really have a deep problem with the interventionist view. This is the one that says God breaks the laws of nature. I just think that if we understand the laws of nature, we understand how they work and what God has done with them, then God can actually do a lot without violating his own laws. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. And leaning towards a non-interventionist view is interesting because I think for a lot of people, they're like, wait, what? That seems kind of like what's going on here. But I think to help, maybe talk about what are the laws of nature, and it can kind of help maybe people understand your view more. So what are the laws of nature?
Sure. Well, that's a big question. There are three main answers. So let me try to run through those kind of quickly. And some are better than others, but these are the ones that are out there in the literature. So the first view is what's called a Humean interpretation of laws, and that's named after the philosopher David Hume. So let me give you a very simple version of it. So just think of some of the basic things that we learn from science. Literally, elementary school level science. Water freezes when the temperature gets below 32 degrees, and air flows from high pressure areas to low pressure areas, and salt dissolves in water. So there's lots of regularities like this in nature that we observe. So for a Humean, a law of nature just is our description of those regularities. So a law of nature is something that you could write down. Just what I said, right? Salt dissolves in water. I can write that down, that little, that sentence, and that then is a law of nature. So for a Humean, laws of nature, again, things you could put on paper, and then that's it. There's nothing out there in reality that makes things happen, that makes, say, salt dissolve or makes water freeze. So for a Humean, this is going to sound kind of weird, I think, but salt doesn't have to dissolve in water. It just does. It just happens to dissolve in water. So Hume himself said that any feeling that you have or that I have, that there's a necessity here, that right when you put the salt in, it's got to dissolve, right? It has to. Hume said that's just a psychological projection on our part. So really all there is the one event, right? There's the salt entering the water, it dissolves, but any sort of sense that one thing causes another, or that the dissolving has to happen, any feeling of necessity, he said that's really us. That's a projection. That's a psychological projection on our part, and there really is no such thing as necessity or causation out there in reality. So that's obviously, I think, the leanest of the three views I'm going to give you metaphysically, right? All that exists are just events, things, and events out there in nature. So again, I don't think that's a very attractive view, but it's among philosophers, among professional philosophers, most of whom are not Christians. That's, I think, the most popular view, the Humean view. A second approach. It's something more like what the ancients had in mind, someone like Aristotle. So it's really not so much an interpretation of the laws of nature. Really, if you understand it, it's a rejection of the laws of nature. So on this view, every entity has a thing in it, and we'll call this thing a disposition, or maybe the causal powers of the thing to act in a certain way. So on this sort of view, when electrons repel each other, the reason they do it is because they have an internal disposition to repel each other. And that salt, again, has a disposition to melt in water. So on this view, every regularity that you see out there in nature is due to these underlying dispositions or causal powers, not the laws of nature. The notion of law, wasn't actually invented or discovered, depending on how you think of it, until the early modern period, until what we think of as the scientific revolution. So the third view, and this is where my view is, this is where I am, is probably more, I think, again, what most of your listeners have in mind. Under what we call a realist view, or a nomological realist view, if you want the fancy word, there really are laws of nature, and they are part of reality itself. The laws of nature are governing the way things go. So on this sort of view, what you see in the textbooks, like Newton's laws, those are descriptions, if they're true, they're descriptions of how the laws work out there in reality. So what's in the textbooks, it might be right, might not be, but the laws of nature, they're just part of reality. They're just out there. And so on this view, what science is attempting to do is to discover those laws, right? When science is working, it's getting at what these laws actually are. And I think, again, that's how most people think of the laws before they start looking into it any further. And as I said, my own view is somewhere in this last category. So I'm a nomological realist of some type or other. I believe there is something that keeps nature on track. And I believe it's the laws of nature that do that, rather than, say, dispositions or causal powers or something like that.
So one of the questions I think that we could get to here is, like, how could these laws be understood as, like, maybe like God's will for the world? You say, like, God creates like this set of laws that govern our universe. Would this kind of be like discerning God's will then? So, like, what are your thoughts with this question?
Yeah, I think actually that's right. So this is one particular stance you could take within that larger group of what I call nomological realism. Okay, so then let me back up just a little bit. I think when we talk about science and the laws of nature today, we tend to do it in completely naturalistic terms, completely secular terms. So if we have a scientific explanation for something in terms of the laws of nature, we often think, oh, well, we don't need God anymore, right? God's irrelevant to the conversation. The two are kind of like competing explanations. We can explain something in terms of God's will, or we can explain something in terms of science. And I think if you look at the history of science, that's just this is actually the way we think of it, the way I just described it, is just completely foreign to the way people would have described it during the scientific revolution. So let me even actually go back a little bit before the scientific revolution. If you go to the Middle Ages, people thought about these things in Aristotelian terms, the way Aristotle thought. So for Aristotle, people knew fire always rises and rocks always fall, not because of the laws of nature, because they didn't believe in laws of nature. Okay? What Aristotle thought was that in some sense, fire and rocks and everything else, it behaves. The reason it behaves the way that it does is because this is the way things want to behave. So it sounds weird, but Aristotle would have said, in some sense, rocks actually want to get to the center of the earth. They have a kind of desire, low-grade desire, not knowledge, not intention, not consciousness, but still a kind of desire. Fire wants to get back to the celestial realm. So that is what explains the regularities in nature. So in the early modern period, in the 17th century, people like Rene Descartes, Isaac Newton, obviously that's a name that everybody knows, and Robert Boyle. You may remember Boyle's law from chemistry. They explained the regularities in nature, not in terms of Aristotelian essences, not in terms of dispositions, but in terms of law. This is where the language of law originates. And for them, if you ask, well, where do these laws of nature come from? They all would have given you the same answer, that they come from a divine law giver. So all these guys were theists, and they said, yeah, the laws of nature are kind of like the laws you see in government. You have a king, who's king of England. King makes the laws for England. Same sort of dynamic, except now you've got a king at a higher level, right? You've got the theistic king. You've got God, and God states what the laws are for nature. And so for most of them, for most of the earliest views on this, the laws, they were just God's decrees for how things would go. So it's not that God created something a law of nature, and like the laws then govern the world on God's behalf. It's more that God just says, this is the way things are going to, at creation itself. God says, this is how it's going to go. And then nature responds. It's really not that different from what you see in Genesis, right? So God says, let there be light, and there's light, right? It happens. Same idea when it comes from the laws of nature. Ultimately, for someone like myself, a decretalist about the laws of nature, the laws of nature just are God's decrees at creation for how nature would go.
So I'm curious here. One of the worries may be someone may say, well, this sounds kind of like deism, where you have like God creating the world and the laws of nature, and it's kind of like his will almost, and the forces play as they be, and it's his will. And he doesn't really intervene in a direct way after that, where it like breaks these laws or anything like that. So how would you respond to like that kind of worry that maybe this is like almost like deism, your idea here?
Yeah, so it's only half the story. What I've given you is half the story about like where the laws come from. So so let's talk about divine intervention now, or divine action. What does God do after creation? So at creation, on my view, again, God sets up the laws of nature, and they're responsible for these regularities. Now, what comes after that, including things like miracles, right? If you want to know what a miracle is, that's of course going to depend on the definition of a miracle. So that philosopher I mentioned before, David Hume, he defined a miracle as the breaking of a law of nature. But again, as I keep saying, that notion of laws, that's a modern idea. So like no one in the Bible would have described a miracle as the breaking of a law of nature, because that idea just wasn't going to be around again yet for hundreds of years. So on my own view, when God acts, at least most of the time, he doesn't break the laws of nature, and that's because the laws themselves, they don't break. The laws adapt to changes that God makes or that we make. This is part of being created in the image of God and having free will. We can do stuff, right? We can make changes out there in reality, and reality corresponds or reacts to that change. So let me give you an analogy. So say you go to a stream. There are laws of fluid dynamics that govern how that stream behaves. We even know what the equations are that describe the sorts of interactions. We can write those down. All right, so say now you take a big rock and you drop it in that stream. So now you've changed the flow of water in the stream. Did you just break the laws of nature? Well, no, because the laws of fluid dynamics, they don't break. They never break. What they do is adapt to the changes you've made. They're going to behave differently in the stream now, and that's fine, right? That the laws can adapt to those sorts of changes. So we make changes in the world all the time. We never break any laws of nature, and that's because, again, the laws adapt to whatever changes we make. So I think that God does do things a lot. God answers prayer in real time. God makes changes in the physical world, but He's made a world. Part of the type of world God has made with the laws of nature is that it allows God to interact with nature, and the laws, just like us in the stream, the laws adapt accordingly. So that's why He doesn't have to break laws of nature when He's interacting with physical reality. God's got free will, just like we do. Really, we have free will like God does, right? Created in His image. So when beings with free will, whether that's us, whether that's an angel, whether that's God, when they act in the physical world adapts to whatever changes they make. So yes, I believe in an interactive God. I'm not at all a deist. Okay, I just think that when God acts, he doesn't have to break the laws of nature. So most of the things then that we think of as miracles, most, maybe not all, but many of the things is God acting, yes, but then nature adapting to those changes. No breaking of the laws of nature. And just so your listeners know, I'm not completely alone in this view. There's a famous Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, contemporary philosophers, argued something like this. And I'm sure your listeners have heard of C.S. Lewis. Actually, C.S. Lewis is a nice little book called On Miracles, and you can find something very close to what I described, in that book. So yeah, my view is not completely unique. I'm actually building on a sort of tradition that goes back even before Lewis. I have found descriptions of this back in at least the 1800s. It probably goes back further, but yeah, at least that far.
That's really interesting. So, looking at like, there's a question in the live chat, and there's something that I kind of had for you. The question of maybe like healings that we'd see is like almost like supernatural. So you talk about like maybe like you lay hands on a blind person and the blind person can see,
Yeah.
or like cancer's gone, or like supernatural healings that believe in along these lines. You think these fit with like the non-interventionist kind of view, where
Yeah.
it's just God kind of causing something to happen, and then like the laws of nature just kind of adapt to God's action here in terms of like this like a supernatural healing?
Yeah, I actually do. So it is supernatural insofar as there's a supernatural being at work, right? So God is at work in this. That's what makes it supernatural. But I would say that when God say, heals someone of cancer, what he's doing is simply, removing cancerous cells, right? He's taking those out of existence, and nature adapts, right? When those things get moved from one place to another or taken out of existence, nature's fine with that. It's just, again, it's like you dropping the rock into the stream, or I guess in this case, picking a big rock up out of the stream, right? The laws of fluid dynamics will adapt to that change, and that's all fine. So yes, I believe in divine healing. What makes it supernatural again is that there's a supernatural being who's at work. It's the supernatural being. It's God's will that actually this act traces back to, but it doesn't need to involve a breaking of the laws of nature.
That's interesting. So one more question I have for you here with regards to this interview is like, why would God create a world with like this set of laws compared to a different set of laws? It's obviously like a very speculative question, and I know you're perfect, so you have the perfect answer for this, Dr. Koperski. But like, what do you think about like, why would God create a world where we have like these kind of laws, maybe whereas compared to like something different?
Yeah. That's a good question. And I don't have a better answer than those guys I was talking about before. You go back to Isaac Newton, you go back to Robert Boyle, and what they would have said is this exact same question is that, well, God had a lot of options when it came to the laws of nature. So it's not like, say, the laws of logic. Maybe when it comes to the basic fundamental logic, there's not a whole lot of different ways God could have put it together. Maybe there's only one way God could have put logic together. But when it comes to the laws of nature, no, there are lots of ways God could have put it together. Lots of sets of laws that God could have chosen. And then again, God was free to choose whichever one he wanted. So there was nothing, say, that compelled God to choose, one set of laws rather than another. He just had, a number of options. Who knows how many? Maybe an infinite number of options. And he just chose. He said, well, it's got to be some way. I'm going to do it this way. And so the problem with that is, if that's how the laws of nature originated, it's ultimately just what we'd call divine fiat. It's just a choice. Then if God doesn't tell us what choices he's made, and he hasn't, right? We don't have direct revelation. There's nothing in the Bible say about what the laws are. Then we have what philosophers would call an epistemic problem, right? How are we going to know it? Because if God's not telling, and so the good part, okay, the upside of the story is that God's given us the ability to go and discover them, but we have to do the work, right? It's not in Revelation, meaning it's not laws of nature are not in the Bible. He hasn't directly, put it into our minds, but he has given us the ability to go out, do the work, and discover them. So the point here is that we can't just sit in a room, no matter how smart the people are that we're dealing with. You can't put a bunch of scientists and philosophers in a room and using reason alone just figure out what the laws of nature are, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, if I asked you, what are the traffic laws, say, in Sweden, so, right? And so, you're smart, I'm fairly smart. Let's just figure it out, right? What would they be? Well, you can't, right? By way of reason alone, you can't figure it out because there's different choices, right? The Swedes could have made, and some are as good as others. You would have to go and see for yourself, right? You'd have to go and discover them. Reason only gets you so far. And so that's the idea when it comes to the laws of nature. So what we have to do then is do experiments, right? We've got to do experiments. We got to make observations. And so when you see this big push for experimentation and observation during the scientific revolution, that big push had a theological motivation to it, right? So like I said, God chose the laws. he's not telling us what they are, but he's given us the ability to go out and find them. So I think, and this is an important point, this notion of empiricism, that's this key, bedrock idea in science. That isn't a secular idea. Okay, that's not something that came from naturalism. That's actually a theistic idea. All these ideas about the laws of nature and everything I've just been talking about, they originate from within a theistic worldview. So, and I should say, as a matter of the history of science, none of that is controversial. It's just that we just generally don't teach that part. When we teach about the history of science or the history of science, we kind of just, either just leave God completely out of it or rush by real quickly any of the theistic aspects of it. But if you read the original sources, if you read the people, again, that I've been talking about, all throughout their writings, God shows up. There's all sorts of theological motivations for their science. It's not like it's not like the way we think of it today, where you've got your science books, right? And you got your theology books over here. They're on different bookshelves, right? They don't really, for them, it's all in there, right? Because it's all part of reality. There's physical reality with the laws of nature. God's responsible for those laws. It was a very holistic, a set of principles, and really, I think, pretty fascinating.
It is really. One question for the live chat that I think is kind of interesting and fitting with what we were talking about. So it says Truth TV is talking about the problem of divine hiddenness, how you respond to answer. Somebody says God is so hidden. So I'm curious, does your view with regards to how does God interact in the world? Does it make any impact on how you look at the question of divine hiddenness? Because I think it's an interesting possible correlation here. So I'm curious if it has any impact.
I think about divine hiddenness. I haven't actually connected the two.
Okay.
Let me think about it just for a second. I do believe in an interactive God. So I respond to divine hiddenness in part in that if there are such things as answers to prayer, right, and we could track these things, then I think that does push back a little bit on hiddenness. So if it's not proof. If someone, this happens all the time, right? I think there are divine healings, and it is God at work. So what does medical science say about that? Well, what is on the charts, right? It's not going to say divine intervention, right? It's not going to say that. What they're going to say is that, well, something happened, but there really is no medical explanation, for what we see here, because the medical explanation, at least the way we think of modern medicine today, you're not allowed to bring God into it. So that means certain explanations are going to run out. But if we're not restricted, right, to simple naturalistic explanations, we're trying to figure out what's the best explanation for what we see. Then I think, if you bring in, the whole, list of I think, again, there's lots of answers to prayer where you kind of feel like, well, it could go either way, right? Did God really, help me get that job or not? There's no proof. There are other ones that, due to the timing and the like, it's like, wow, it really seems like something happened here, right? I had a student, this was very early in my teaching career, who you could see he had headgear on, trying to protect his head. And he came and told me after class one day, after I was in a philosophy religion class, that he had a brain tumor, and he had been preparing for surgery. Already had some minor things done, but the big major surgery was about to happen. And he was not a Christian, not a theist, but he was willing to do anything that could possibly work. And some Christians at a church he knew had offered to pray for him. So the week before he was supposed to go in for surgery, had this prayer service for him, and he was like, he didn't feel anything. Nothing miraculous happened as far as he could tell. Then he had one more brain scan the day before the surgery, and the tumor's gone. Okay, now no medical explanation, right? That just happens sometimes, but the timing is awfully odd, right? It's really pretty amazing, right? And so I think there is some justifications to the idea that this was actually an answer to prayer. There's something divine and supernatural at work in this. Is there proof? Can I actually get at the finger of God? And no. It's really more a matter of bringing about our best explanation for all the information that we have. It's not that different. I do this in class all the time. It's not that different really from basic science. I take it, you Zach and your listeners, they all believe in electrons.
Hmm.
You've never seen one. You're not going to see one. Okay, they're not like they're in a jar in the chem lab over there buzzing around. Electrons are intrinsically unobservable. All those fundamental particles that you hear about, like quarks and leptons and the like, they're unobservable. Okay, we can't see them. Why do we believe in them? Well, because they're part of theories that we have that work really well. I mean, if you look at chemistry, you look at electromagnetism, electrons show up in those theories and they do work, right? I mean, it seems like they really are doing something. So they're part then of our best overall explanation for the things that we do observe in nature. I think the same thing is true of God and your question of hiddenness. I think we can push back some on the notion of divine hiddenness, the worry of hiddenness, in terms of answered prayer. I think for some things we see in the world, the best explanation for those events is that, yeah, these are supernatural events where God has answered a prayer or done something in the world. Is it proof? Is it a direct observation? Can we see the finger of God at work? No, can't see that. But I do think you can come up with theistic explanations for things that are the best explanations for those things. Yeah, God appears in those explanations. Does that solve the problem of divine hiddenness? Do we wish, or maybe would have expected that there'd be more, right? That God would be more obvious. I wish, as a theist, I kind of wish God were more obvious. And God has apparently decided, not to be quite that obvious about how he goes about things. But is there evidence for God? Are there reasons to believe in God? Yeah, absolutely. It's not just a matter of faith, where faith is something like just deciding to believe. I don't hold that view of faith. Okay, that's not the reason I believe in God. And so, at least to that degree, I would say yes, my views do have something to say about the notion of divine hiddenness. Is it an answer? No, it's kind of oblique. Kind of hits it along the edges.
That's really interesting. So to wrap things up here, I have one more question for you. Justin Fields, how does he end up in his NFL career?
Justin Fields.
And for those of you who don't know, he's the Ohio State quarterback that just left for the NFL and was a first-round pick. So I had to throw that in there.
Yeah, that's fine. I am not terribly bullish on Fields in the NFL. Good. I think he's going to be one of those college quarterbacks that will end up being pretty average at best in the NFL. I actually thought their previous quarterback, Dwayne Haskins, I thought he was the better NFL ready quarterback, and it didn't work out for him. Right, he was a first round pick like Fields, and he didn't make it. So I don't know. Maybe there's things. I mean, I'm just a guy who watches these games on TV. Okay, but I wouldn't be really too hopeful on Justin Fields. I hope he does, but if it's me, I don't think I would have drafted him quite that early.
Well, for an Ohio State fan, you're not very optimistic on your guy, Justin.
He doesn't play for us anymore. Okay, I'm just telling you. Yeah, so
well, it'll be interesting. But Dr. Koperski, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been so much fun, so many interesting things to think about. Do you have any last thoughts, things you want to say before we wrap things up here?
No, I think that's about it. I should say that the book that I put out on this topic, it's free. I had a grant through the John Templeton Foundation, and so if you look up my name on the Routledge, the publisher, if you go to their website, you can actually download a PDF of the whole book for free. If you have any listeners out there who are interested, you can follow me on Twitter. All right, so ask me questions or send me email. If you have any listeners out there who have follow-up questions, I'm happy to interact with you. My email address is just Koperski, Koperski at svsu.edu. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have.
Definitely. Well, Dr. Koperski, thank you so much for joining me today. I encourage everyone to check out the book. There's also a link down below if you want to follow him on Twitter. I should put the name. Someone just asked, what is the name of the book for someone that's looking for it?
Oh, what is the name of my book? Hang on. It's this. If you can see it, right? So, divine action determinism and the laws of nature. Okay, so there's the hard copy, but again, the PDF is available for free.
Well, it's awesome, and I encourage everyone to check out that book. I'll link it. I'll check it out and link it down below as soon as we're done here. And if you're new to the channel, I always encourage you to subscribe to Here in Apologetics. Really appreciate your subscription, whether you're listening via YouTube or podcast. And if you enjoy the show, you can support us on Patreon.com/Here in Apologetics. We're about 85% of the way to our funding goal. So if you want to join for as little as $1 a month, that would be appreciated. But Dr. Koperski, one last time, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Zach. Glad to be here.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Susan, thank you, Jesus. Ethan, everyone else, have a good one. God bless.